But I think I want to suggest to you that they also explain why Western dominance is over. Because the single most important thing to happen in our lifetime is the end of Western predominance. That's the big story. And it started in 1978. Why do I say that? Because from around about then, more and more of the killer apps were downloaded by non-Western societies. And it turns out this was open access software all along. Anybody could copy the way that the West does things, and they did. The Chinese, beginning with the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, later the Indians, soon pretty much everybody in the Asian world was downloading at least some, if not all, of the killer applications of Western civilization. And that, I think, is the key to understanding the world that we live in today. I want to suggest to you, and then I'm going to shut up and ask you to ask me questions. I want to suggest to you that there are two distinct processes at work here. In one process, as I've described it, the rest copy our institutions. This actually began a bit before '78. You could say that the Japanese had been doing it for nearly a century since the Meiji era. But it's really it's from the late 70s that more and more of non-Western societies engages in this kind of replication. So that's part of the process. And you know what? I think it's great. I am delighted. I celebrate the fact that 300 plus million Chinese people have been lifted out of poverty because finally their leaders realized the kind of institutions that their country needed, that they needed competition, that they needed science. That's not the thing I worry about. The thing I worry about is the second process that is going on right now. The process whereby we in the West delete the killer apps, which it seems to me is a separate but powerful process that we can measure right now. Let me illustrate the point very briefly. Competition, competitiveness, I mentioned it earlier. The World Economic Forum and a bunch of other institutions, the World Bank, take a lot of time these days to quantify competitiveness, country by country around the world. What is really interesting, if you take the World Economic Forum data, is that since they standardized their measure of competitiveness 7 years ago, the United States has markedly declined in its competitiveness. Its score is down about 7%. In the same period, China's score is up 20%. And that's just one of a whole bunch of measures that I could give you to suggest that Western societies, not only the United States, are losing their competitive edge. In terms of science, it's true that Nobel Prizes still generally go to people at US institutions, but have you noticed that Nobel Prizes mostly go to old guys? If you ask about the scientific competence of teenagers in the world today, it's a different story. The OECD does this wonderful PISA test. It's a standardized test of 15-year-olds' attainment in math and science and literacy around the world. 2009, for the first time, they included China. Guess what? The Chinese came top in all three categories. Here's a shocking fact. The gap between the teenagers in the Shanghai district of China and the teenagers in the United States, in terms of mathematical attainment, I don't like this microphone. The gap between the Shanghai teenagers and the American teenagers in math is as big as the gap between the American teenagers and teenagers in Albania and Tunisia. The rule of law. Americans, I should say citizens of the United States, think that they still lead the world in terms of the rule of law. They are wrong. There are 15 different measures of the quality of legal institutions in the World Economic Forum survey. 15. In only one is the United States in the top 30 countries in the world. You'll be glad to hear that Canada beats the United States on 15 out of 15 measures. In fact, at the risk of sounding like I'm flattering my audience, Canada looks remarkably good compared with other Western societies in terms of its institutional quality. The concern I have that there is a real degeneration of institutions in the Western world applies less to Canada than it does to the United States and most European countries. If you look at the scores for a country like Italy in terms of institutional quality, if you didn't know it was Italy, you would assume you were looking at some sub-Saharan African country with a rampant problem of corruption. Anybody who wants to understand the crisis of the Eurozone has to look behind the finances, has to look behind the bank balance sheets and see a profound degeneration, a decline in institutional quality that is the real sign of Western civilization's malaise. By all the 6 measures, not only are the rest gaining, but more seriously, the West is slipping. And that, in many ways, is the most important point that the book makes in conclusion. What's the good news? I'll offer a couple of pieces. First, this is about institutions. It's about man-made things. It's, in theory at least, fixable in a way that it wouldn't be if we were talking about deep cultural traits or geography. The problems that the West currently faces can be addressed, but that requires political will, which, it seems to me, is mostly lacking. The second piece of good news is that while many non-Western societies have successfully downloaded our killer apps, there's one in particular that China seems reluctant to download, and that's killer app number 3. The rule of law based on private property rights is an app that is not easily reconcilable with one-party rule. To me, the biggest challenge that China faces is not a real estate bubble or any other problem. The real challenge that China faces is transitioning from a system in which the rule of law is essentially what the party wants to a system in which the rule of law is real and the private property rights of the new and rapidly growing middle class are genuinely protected. They're not there yet. And perhaps until they get there, we shouldn't call time on Western predominance. You're lucky. You have here the perfect barometer of the process that I'm describing. For as long as China lacks the rule of law, for as long as they don't download all the killer apps, and in particular, as long as they don't download the rule of law in John Locke's sense, then I promise you, Chinese millionaires will want to buy your homes. Thank you very much indeed.
First of all, I just wanted to say that you know, I agreed with many things that you said, but you seem to think that having lunch with a banker wasn't a fantastically cultural opportunity. You have not had lunch with bankers from TD, right? I'm sure that many of you will agree it is a fantastically cultural, wonderful experience. In fact, I had lunch with Jane just last week. So I wanted to say that. Secondly, please don't cancel your subscriptions to The Economist because, of course, as you know, the editor of The Economist, John Micklethwaite, is our next speaker. And if you do that, I'm going to tell him that you told everybody to cancel their subscriptions to his magazine.
Yeah, so, well, after the review they gave my last book, it's the least I can do.
I think they also ranked Vancouver badly in terms of our infrastructure because there was a slow highway in Victoria. So we're going to bring that up with him. So I'll just ask the first question while we get some other ones collected. So I was quite intrigued with your comment about political will and how we really need political will to make sure that we stop deleting our killer apps. From a historical perspective, and going back as far as you like, what lessons can we learn about creating political will to make the right policy decisions?
It's a hard thing to generalize about, needless to say. Whenever I look at the way in which the United States makes decisions about fiscal policy, I'm reminded of Winston Churchill's great quip, which I think I quote in the book, that the United States always does the right thing when all the alternatives have been exhausted. And we are in a process of exhausting alternatives right now. The United States, some of us were discussing this earlier today informally, is in a completely unsustainable fiscal path. There's no question at all in my mind that fiscal policy on its present trajectory will bring the United States to a major crisis within certainly 10 years. And that's easy to show because you just need to calculate the share of federal tax revenues being absorbed by interest payments on the federal debt. I'm now going to use the words in the English language that I hate the most. Some of you may wish to cover your ears. If Paul Krugman is right, which is not wholly inconceivable, and interest rates in the United States don't move up suddenly out of market fear at this fiscal trajectory, even if he's right, the consistent growth of the debt will consistently grow the share of tax revenues absorbed by interest payments. Currently it's 10%. If you look at the Congressional Budget Office projections, by 2050 it will be 100%. Now that's an impossibility, and that shows you that something's got to give. But what is completely missing at the moment is any clear path that will take us from this unsustainable trajectory to one in which even within 10 years there's anything resembling fiscal equilibrium. In practice, we have a game of brinkmanship between the two parties. And that game of brinkmanship is a very dangerous game. The debt ceiling game will be played again this year. We're heading towards a train wreck if the so-called sequestration process goes into effect next year. That's drastic cuts across the board, affecting every government agency. And I have to say, I struggle to see how out of this political system the kind of leadership that you were talking about, Leah, can come. I wish I could say that I see it in the field of candidates for the Republican nomination. One thing that Don didn't mention when he was quoting headlines from my Newsweek column is that the one thing you don't write as a journalist is the headline. And sometimes I look at those headlines and go, what? And that was true of the Niall Ferguson endorses Mitt Romney headline, which I don't think I did, but at any event, it's hard to believe when one looks at the way that campaign is going, that we're dealing here with leadership in the Churchillian mode. And that's what the United States needs, what it needs. It needs somebody with that capacity of courage that we last saw in Britain in Margaret Thatcher. Whether it can magically materialize before the crisis, I frankly doubt. My fear is that, as with national security issues, the United States will not take that necessary measure, that necessary step, until after the crisis has struck. And believe me, none of us will be unscathed if that's the case.
We've got a microphone right here. Frank?
Just wondering what your view is, or your greatest criticism of Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which took the view that evolution of the world happened by accidental reasons, and yours, which was by design.
Let me make it clear, I have the greatest respect for Jared Diamond as a scholar, and Guns, Germs, and Steel is a fantastic book that everybody should read. It explains a lot. It explains why Eurasia became richer in the